Hello again. It's good to be with you as we continue our study in Philippians. And I would urge you to go ahead, if you have not yet, go ahead and read the whole letter of Philippians. It's only 4 chapters. It won't take you very long to read it, and I think you'll find it to be a very helpful and beneficial read. It's really a positive book in the New Testament. It has really lots of good messaging within it. Now, as I'm working through, I'm only doing 8 or 10 verses at a time, so it's kind of hard, I guess, for me to segment out what you should do. But what I would encourage you to do is just go ahead. If you haven't read chapter 1 of Philippians yet, I just stop this video right now and go ahead and read chapter 1 of Philippians, because I'll be dealing with some material in chapter 1 today. We're actually going to be looking at verses 12 through around 20 or 21. I don't think we'll get much past that, but that's what we'll be doing. But if you read the whole of chapter 1, it'll give you a good feel for what's going on there. And then also, I'll be dealing with chapter 1 some more next week. So, verse 12, let's start right there. So, Paul begins with a purpose. He has some reason that he's wanting to share this information. Now, in a letter, of an ancient letter like this, it's often included within the writing some information about the letter writer's welfare, how maybe their health, maybe something else. There's usually a little bit in there sometimes. Now, it doesn't have to be, but this would be the area of the letter where you would probably put this kind of information at, in just a typical letter. So Paul's following basically the typical format for a letter in the ancient times. And he shares this welfare section, and we find out within this section that Paul is in prison. In fact, we found that out in verse 7 of chapter 1, but he begins to talk about this again. And we also find out that there are some characters, some other people out there that don't have a positive view about Paul and about his ministry, and they're wanting to cause some kind of problems. So, in verse 12, he starts off with this purpose. He wants them to know. He desires. That's what he says. I desire for you to know. So he's wanting them to have some kind of knowledge about himself. So he's quieting the concern. They could be very, very concerned about what's going on. I'm sure they have one person who's from the area, Epaphroditus. So he may have already been in contact with people, sharing what the predicament is with Paul at this moment. So they are concerned, I'm sure. He is imprisoned. Probably in Rome, because of the praetorium reference that shows up here, even though some would argue that it could be a location in Caesarea. It could be. There's no doubt about it. But you have to understand why Paul's in the predicament he is within Philippians. He has requested an audience with Caesar, which he can do because he is a citizen of Rome. The Roman Empire. Paul is a citizen of the Roman Empire. He can ask for this request, and many scholars think that he is somewhere in Rome or Italy or something to that effect, and that he's under this watch within the imperial household, so somewhere close, let's put it that way, within close to the emperor or within his confines, close by, let's put it that way. But anyway, he is in prison, and he's in prison because of some false claims that some Jewish people made about him back in Acts. So you remember what's going on in Acts. He is charged with bringing a Gentile into the area of the temple where you could not bring a Gentile. It's not true. In fact, I don't even know why Paul gets involved in this. James gets him to want to go through this ritual, which really is an old covenant ritual, has nothing to do with the new covenant, but Paul relents, I guess, and does it anyway. But anyway, he's accused of bringing a Gentile into these confines of the temple where a Gentile could not go. So he goes before the Sanhedrin, then he goes before some Roman administrators, and then finally he requests an audience with the Roman emperor because he can as a citizen. So this is what's going on at this time. Now, his adversaries seem to think that, from the information we get in verse 12, that, and onward, as we keep on, that they have thwarted Paul. For some reason, they have this very negative view about Paul's ministry. And I'm going to come back to this in just a little bit. So I don't want to talk about these teachers too much. In fact, I'm going to call them false teachers. But they believe that this imprisonment has been a preventative measure in Paul's ministry. So they're very upset about his ministry of salvation through Christ. Now, they are doing something a little bit similar, but not exactly similar. And I'll tell you exactly what's going on with these teachers here pretty soon. But their attempt to prevent the advancement of the gospel is it's not succeeded. In fact, it's been a failure. Paul says that the ministry is expanding, and there's evidence of it even within his arresting circle, the people that are around him. And so they've had the exact opposite effect of what his enemies wanted him to do. So at verse 13, Paul goes on and explains that about the praetorium. And these are elite guards in the Roman military. In fact, if you remember when I did the overview, I told you that Philippi was a military colony. Well, this is why he uses the term praetorium. They would know exactly who these people are. Regular people are not going to understand these. This is a classification for soldiers. And so these are retired soldiers in Philippi. So they would know exactly who these guards are. These are elite guards. These are personal soldiers that serve around the emperor itself. So in a sense, you could say maybe these are your best soldiers at that time. I don't know if I want to make any analogies to today's soldiers. I don't think that's probably appropriate. But the people in Philippi who were retired military for the most part would know who Paul is talking about when he says the praetorium. Now, he says they know the real reason why Paul is imprisoned. They know it's because of Christ. So they know that these charges that the Jewish people have brought against Paul, and then later on the Romans want to just leave it in the Jewish people's hands, but Paul actually appeals to the Roman Caesar. And so this is what's going on right now. But while he's there and as he's talking to these guards, the praetorium guards, they understand why he's there and what these claims are a sham against him, or this claim is a sham, and they know what he's really there for. It's for his Christian ministry and promoting Christianity. Now, it seems that he's having some effect upon these people. Now, it doesn't tell us conclusively that he has won converts, but it seems that he's having some success in reaching them to some degree. He talks about the advancement of the gospel even while he's being imprisoned. I have to understand that he's talking about the advancement of the gospel. And when I say that, I'm talking about the ministry of salvation through Jesus Christ. The advancement of that ministry has prospered within his imprisonment. So I assume, again, the text doesn't say this, but I assume from the information, I think we can safely infer that he has had some success with some soldiers being receptive, maybe even converting to Christianity. Now, this would be tough to get soldiers to convert to Christianity. They worship Mithras, even though it was an Eastern mystery religion, and Romans generally were they had an ill view towards those kind of religions because it was the soldiers, and this religious cult was really a cult of virility and strength. It was a masculine type of worship, let's put it that way. So it drew these kind of people to this. So my point is that it would be very hard for Paul to win some converts from this group. However, I think we can assume, and I think safely, that he has had some success. Now in verse 14, his imprisonment has already seems to have been a success because he's been treated so well. Now, he's not being treated necessarily well by his guards. That's not what necessarily is going on here. So he's talking about, in fact, let me look at this real quick. Verse 14. His imprisonment has actually had a positive effect on other Christians. That's what he's trying to say here. I had to look at the text again to see where we were at. But he has this, people are learning about what's going on here and how the imprisonment against Paul was false, for one thing, but also it's not as vicious. It's not as tough as what others have experienced, I guess, under imprisonment. Basically, it seems like Paul's having an easier imprisonment. Now, I say it's because God is taking care of him. But again, I can't say that directly from the text. I can only say that because I think that's what's happening in this instance, and we've seen it happening in other instances within Paul's ministry, where God protects Paul to some degree. Paul's out there doing ministry, very courageous. He's put himself in danger. Read 2 Corinthians 11. He talks about all the dangers that he goes through. Read that information. He experiences lots of hardships, and God is always there taking care of him as he goes. So, this has had a positive effect upon others who are doing the gospel ministry also. And they no longer have the fear of going out there and sharing the message. So it's starting to have a positive effect even upon those people as they're starting to be reassured about about their role in the ministry of the gospel, and also about the future success that they want to enjoy. And again, I come back to this. I do think God is protecting Paul to some degree. It could have been a lot worse for him. There's no doubt about it. In fact, let's put it this way. We know that Paul was protected in Acts 28 as he's going to Rome. So even though Philippians, the letter of Philippians, or the letter of Colossians, or the Philemon maybe, Ephesians wouldn't have it. But these letters, Ephesians is considered a prison letter, but these prison letters do not tell us exactly how or why Paul is being treated fairly well. There's no indication there. Most of these people, in fact, maybe his Roman citizenship may have had some bearing upon this, but it seems that from other accounts, as I was getting ready to say, from Acts 28, we know that Paul was shipwrecked on Malta. Their ship ran aground, and while he's there, he's bitten by a poison snake, and nothing happens to him. So over and over, we see this protection that is afforded Paul and his ministry. And here we see that things are going very well for him, and because of that, others don't have the fear that they used to have of being imprisoned for the gospel message. Now, in verse 15, this is where things start to get very, very interesting when we start talking about these false teachers. So we'll be on this for just a little bit. But he says in verse 15, some are preaching for the wrong reasons. In fact, he uses the word jealousy and contention there. You may have envy and strife. In fact, it probably says something in effect of, indeed, some preach also on account of or because of envy and strife or something. But the idea is jealousy and contention. So he's setting up very early in this letter a comparison between himself and these other teachers. And they are not doing it with the right intentions. And so we're going to see these models all the way through. In fact, we're going to have examples of good teachers, and then we're going to have examples of false teachers, the Judaizers, and then we also have an example of two women who seem to be in contention. Now this comes up in chapter 4, so we'll talk about this in greater detail there, but they seem to be in contention about something also. So they're actually a bad example, even though Paul addresses it and tells them to correct some things. They seem to be a bad example, but he does give them some kind of praise for their industrious effort within the gospel ministry. But going back, we have some preaching from envy and strife, and it seems to be Paul setting up this comparison between himself and others. And so he says, however, there's some that preach from goodwill, actually is what he said, or a good intention. Now let me talk about these, the ones that are preaching from the wrong reasons. It has to be Paul's Jewish opponents. Now why in the world would Paul have Jewish opponents? That is a good question. Paul was a Jew himself. He was a Pharisee. It seems like some of these opponents that he has could have came from the Pharisaic strain of thinking. We know, for example, in Acts that there are many Pharisees who do come to the Christian faith. But it doesn't tell us a whole lot about them. But we do see after they come into the faith, we start to see problems arising in Acts 15, or when they come into Christianity, I should say. We start having problems in Acts 15 where they're addressing the issue of circumcision. Should Christians be circumcised? They're addressing the issue of the Sabbath. Should Christians be tied to the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath on Saturday? They're dealing with food restrictions and these kind of things. So these are Jewish concerns. So it seems like what is happening from the record that we have in Acts, that we have these Jewish, we'll just say, religious leaders, religious affiliations, colleagues. I do think they're from the Pharisaic background, but anyway, and we have priests too that are coming in. So we have lots of things going on in the the beginning of Christianity, and people are bringing stuff in. But these Jewish opponents, for some reason, are against Paul. It could be, and he's going to address these people later, and it seems like a lot of it is jealousy. In chapter 3, he'll begin to talk about this. But Paul will definitely compare himself, his ministry, and his intentions against their wrong intentions and their attempt to try to hinder his ministry later on. I'll come back to the false teachers in just a minute, but I want to keep on going through this because he begins to address more things about these teachers. So, now, he talks about some preaching from goodwill in verse 15. Well, we have examples of that later on in Philippians 2. Remember a couple of weeks ago I told you, and in fact I told you in the overview of, or not the overview, but how to read the Bible for all it's worth, about how in Paul's letters, the introductory section, there will often be introductory elements that will be addressed later on within the letter itself. Well, here we have something. Again, there are some in the letter itself who do preach from good intentions. There are Timothy and there are Epaphroditus, and we're going to encounter those when we get to chapter 2. And Paul's going to mention their good intentions and their good ministry efforts. In verse 16, he talks about some people do it from the love of Christ. Now, those are the people who have the good intentions. Okay, so there's some people who are doing it for the right reason. The love of Christ is within them, and they want to share the love of Christ to other people. Now, they know that Paul will utilize this predicament that he's in. They're going to use that. He's going to use it to defend the message of Christianity. That's what he's going to do. So, his opponents are trying to say that his imprisonment is an indication that his ministry is unsuccessful, not from God. I don't know. But Paul turns around and says, hey, no, I'm still, even though I'm in prison, the gospel is advancing, even within my circle of influence, but outside of it also. And people who initially were scared of what was going on because of my imprisonment now have become courageous because they realize that this is not as severe as what they thought it was going to be. And so the gospel is starting to gain steam again. His ministry is starting to gain steam again. And these Jewish opponents are not able to stop it. Now, I want to come back to this, what's going on with the Jewish teachers, or his Jewish opponents. But here's here it is in a nutshell, a very simplistic statement. These Jewish opponents are wanting to incorporate Old Covenant. This is Old Testament stuff. The Old Covenant into the New Covenant and to make some kind of a different covenant. It's not even the New Covenant anymore. It's some kind of mixture, amalgamation of the Old Covenant shoved into the New Covenant. So I'll come back to some of the elements here in a minute, but that's basically what they're trying to do. And Paul is saying, hey, my ministry itself, in fact, he defends himself to some degree, like, if I was doing the wrong thing, then this shouldn't be happening. The advancement of the gospel should not be occurring. But it is, so it must be the right thing. Now, verse 17. The group that hinders Paul, these Judaizers, they are teaching wrong. Okay, they think that they have, as I said, they think they've stopped Paul. And they think they've made it more difficult for Paul. But in some sense, yeah, I mean, nobody wants to be in prison. There's no doubt about it. But Paul is able to take this difficult circumstance, this difficult period of time in his life, and he's able to make something good happen out of it. You know the old saying, if the world gives you lemons, make lemonade. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. This is not the best circumstance for Paul. It'd be so much better if he were out there preaching and defending his gospel. In fact, he wants to. His opponents think they've stopped him because he's in prison, but he says, no, it's not stopped. And he will continue to defend his ministry. And the success of his ministry is a defense against the accusations of the Jewish opponents. Now, as I said, in verse 18, Paul decides to be positive here. Even though we have this false teaching going on and these Jewish opponents running around, he says, you know what? At least Christ is mentioned. Now, again, this is not ideal. This is not ideal at all. This is not what Paul wants. But this is the predicament he's in. So he tries to make a bad situation into a positive situation by giving the benefits, the possibilities, the opportunities here. At least Christ is being mentioned, he says. Now, it might be, they're not teaching about him correctly. True. But at least he is being mentioned. So people are starting to hear about Christ who have never heard before. Now, again, this is not ideal. It's not about just as long as Christ is mentioned, we can do anything we want to kind of approach. No, Paul is trying to take a bad situation and present it in a positive way, a possibility of a positive outcome. Let's put it that way. Now, he is going to get harsher as we go on through about some of this stuff. So don't think that Paul is just comfortable with this. It's not a problem. It is a problem. But Paul can do nothing about it right now while he's sitting in prison or he's sitting under arrest. He's going to have to wait. Now, these false teachers, let me talk about these real quick. They are Jewish people. They seem to be coming out of Jerusalem. It's odd, but they are. We really don't know a lot about them. We know some material in Galatians that shares some material with us about these Judaizers. In fact, that's where the word appears. In 2 Corinthians, we have this problem rising again. In fact, it's hinted at in 1 Corinthians, but in 2 Corinthians, it definitely comes out. And they're called super apostles there. And so we have these opponents that he encounters regularly. And they're, as I said, they're attempting to combine old covenant principles into the new covenant. Such things as the idea that you must become a Jewish person before you become a Christian. And that you must keep the old covenant guidelines or practices, certain ones, like circumcision and dietary restrictions and the Sabbath observance and observance of festivals. So basically they wanted you to become a Jewish person before you could become a Christian, and then to maintain those Jewish forms of worship, I guess, in your Christian walk. Now simply, it's this. They are adding requirements to the Christian way of life, Christianity. They're adding requirements to the new covenant. So they're adding requirements to Christian salvation. How? You got to become a Jew before you become a Christian. That is not true. You don't have to become a Jewish person to become a Christian. They're trying to add instructions about Christian living. You must worship on Saturday. You must observe the Jewish festivals. No, that is not true. Those things are not true at all. They are adding these things to the new covenant that are not stipulated for the new covenant. So, this is what a lot of people would call legalism. I would agree, where you start adding requirements to the new covenant that are not there. It happens all the time, and mainly it happens just because people don't know what is in the new covenant. Now, there is a great mix-up between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Most Christians don't know what to do with the New Testament, or the Old Testament, excuse me. The Old Testament is historic. Yes, there is good instruction there about God, and we can learn great things about the characteristics of God. We can learn great things about the interaction between God and Old Covenant people, for sure. But as far as like binding principles coming from the Old Testament upon Christianity, they're not there. The books for Christian living, the books for salvation, Christian salvation and Christian living, are in the New Testament. That's where we go to find out how we are to have salvation, how we are to live as a Christian. So when we start adding things to that what's there in the New Testament, that's called legalism. And we're doing the same thing that the Jewish opponents were doing when we do that. We cannot do that. So the best defense against that is just to get to know what's in the New Covenant. Know it, and know it very, very well. So these false teachers are Jewish, and they're talking about Christ. It's not like they deny Christ. They accept Christ, but they don't accept Christ as Lord. They accept him as a high prophet, or a qualified teacher, or something to that effect, a wise teacher, something to that effect, a man of God maybe, but they don't understand him as the Son of God. They don't understand him as Lord. That's the key, Lord. So they're not understanding Christ the same way that Paul is, and that's probably why Paul makes this wonderful explanation about what was transpiring between the Father and the Son as Jesus was ready to come into this world as the incarnate Son of God. What was going on? So in Philippians 2, 6 through 10, we have this wonderful instruction about this occurrence and how Jesus handled himself in this mode. I want to save this until we get there, but when we get there, just remember that this is about the difference in the way that Paul understands Christ. Paul understands Christ to be the Son of God, God himself, in human form. He is Lord. There is no other Lord. Jewish people are not accepting Jesus at the same level of reverence. Let's put it that way. Now in verse 19, Paul expects some deliverance. In fact, the word that's used here is the word for salvation. However, he's in prison, so as he's talking, he's talking about maybe I could be delivered from prison. Well, that would be either he's being found innocent or death, one of the two. And so he's going to have deliverance. He knows that. It's either going to be a release, he's going to be let go, or he's going to die. But there is going to be some release. Now, he doesn't know for sure, and we're going to see this next week, but he assumes that he's going to continue on and he will live. But at this point, he doesn't know for sure. But again, he's trying to be positive, so later on he's going to talk about he thinks he will continue on to be profitable, useful in this ministry of the gospel. Let's put it that way. And then in verse 20, there's an exaltation of Christ by Paul in life or death. And I want to stop right there because in verse 21 is really good too, because he says, this would be a good one to stop on. And I just want to read verse 21 because I think it's just so powerful. He says basically, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So if he is to live, it is to honor Christ. If he is to die, it won't be a loss for him. Actually, it'll be a gain because he'll be able to go see the Lord. But he's getting ready to move into this next part where he's going to talk about that he thinks he is going to continue on and that this is going to turn out to be more positive for his ministry, so forth and so on. But regardless, whatever happens, Paul is content. Think about this. Contentment is a major idea in Philippians also. Philippians 4, he's going to talk about I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Well, that's talking about financial contributions in his ministry. And so Paul is very, very content because he is very, very close to the Lord. So if he is to continue on, then his focus will be on doing the ministry of Christ. And if his time is over, then he is ready to go home and be with the Lord. All right, well, that's good to talk with you today. Next week, we'll pick it up right there. We'll finish out chapter 1 next week. So if you want to have all of chapter 1 read, that'd be awesome. In fact, I would encourage you just to go ahead and read all of Philippians. But next week for sure, we will finish chapter 1. And I hope this has been helpful for you. And I hope you have a great Friday. Take care. Bye.